On what seemed like a routine morning, a garbage collector witnessed something that would forever change his life. As he made his regular rounds, he noticed a woman, her shoulders slumped, tears streaming down her face bringing out her trash. Her distraught expression caught his attention, and though his instinct was to help, her hostile reaction pushed him to keep his distance. But when he returned to collect her container, he saw something that made his heart stop, something being crushed in the compactor that no one should ever throw away. It was another gray morning in Cedar Grove, the kind of morning Ethan Carter had seen 1,000 times in his years as a garbage collector. The truck's engine hummed steadily as it made its way through the familiar streets. Ethan had driven this route for a decade, collecting the trash of the quiet neighborhood as the sun peeked through the clouds and the dew began to dry on the sidewalk. Ethan was used to the routine. The damp air clung to his skin as he climbed into the cab of the truck, his hands steady on the wheel. He was no stranger to early mornings. 10 years of service had made this job second nature. Each house on his route was etched in his mind, each neighbor's quirks, and their small exchanges of pleasantries or nods of acknowledgement. It was a job that gave him a sense of purpose, though the weight of his own past often lingered in the background. The truck rolled down the street, passing the neat, well-kept lawns of Cedar Grove. The sun had just started breaking through the clouds, casting soft light on the rows of houses. Ethan's mind was mostly blank, his focus solely on the task at hand, until something unusual caught his eye. At House B9, he saw a woman standing by her trash container. Her posture was hunched, and there was something in her demeanor that immediately caught his attention. Her shoulders were slumped, her face twisted in anguish, and tears streaked down her cheeks. She was alone. The sight was unusual, the crying itself, but the weight of it, the openness of her vulnerability in the early morning. Ethan's first instinct was to pull over, to ask if she was okay, to offer help in some small way. It was what he would have wanted for anyone to do if he were in her position. But as he slowed the truck, he saw her glance up, her eyes narrowing at him. There was a coldness in her gaze, a defensive hostility that stopped him in his tracks. Without a word, she turned back to the trash bin, dragging it toward the curb. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door handle. He knew he wasn't supposed to get involved, and the look she gave him made it clear that his presence wasn't welcome. So he did what he did best, stayed in his truck, kept to his work, and moved on. As the truck rumbled down the street, Ethan couldn't shake the image of the woman. There was something about her, something raw and unsettled, that gnawed at him. He couldn't tell if it was the anger in her expression, the silent pain she seemed to carry, or the loneliness that hung around her like a cloud. Whatever it was, he felt it deeply, more than he wanted to admit. He continued his route, moving from house to house, but the woman from B9 stayed in the back of his mind. It wasn't like him to get so caught up in the lives of others. His job was simple: collect the trash, move on. But something about that morning, something about her, wouldn't let him forget. Later, as Ethan was collecting the last few bins of the block, he turned the corner, heading back toward B9 to finish his route. The truck's lifting mechanism clanged as it hoisted the last few containers. Ethan was still thinking about the woman, about her tears, her anger, and her sadness. He thought maybe he'd catch her again, offer a few kind words if she was still around. Maybe this time he'd be able to help. But when he arrived at the spot where her container had been placed, his heart sank. It wasn't there. Ethan looked up and down the street, confused. Had she moved it back? Was she waiting to come out with it later? His thoughts turned back to his morning encounter, wondering what had driven her to tears, what had made her so withdrawn and defensive. He sighed, pushing the thoughts aside. He had a job to do. As he stood there looking at the empty curb, something caught his eye. He glanced over at the truck's compactor, the mechanical arm that lifted the bins, and the large metal drum that crushed the trash. He had barely left the container for a moment, but something about the way the trash was shifting inside the compactor made his stomach tighten. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes widening in horror as he saw the bin's contents being crushed by the mechanism. A sharp metallic noise echoed through the truck as the compactor did its work. But this time, Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold. Among the discarded items, there were baby clothes newly bought, clearly not meant for the trash. Stuffed animals. A Moses basket. all items that seemed far too personal to end up in the compactor. His heart stopped. He immediately realized that something was very wrong. The suddenness of the discovery left him shaken. He should have known there was more to the woman's distress than just an argument. The baby items, the way she'd dragged herself to the bin earlier, should have connected the dots. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, staring at the crushed remnants. What had he just seen? His instincts screamed at him to stop the truck, to get out and do something, but the sheer force of what he was witnessing paralyzed him. He'd seen people's lives fall apart, but this was different. This wasn't just discarded trash. It was evidence of a deeper tragedy. It was a routine day for Ethan Carter. The streets of Cedar Grove had always been quiet, and his mornings were predictable. The familiar sounds of the truck and the rhythm of his work filled his mind as he maneuvered down the street, stopping to collect the trash bins one by one. But when he reached House B9, something unusual caught his attention. The first sign of trouble came in the form of raised voices, angry and desperate. Ethan's eyes instinctively flicked toward the porch of the neighboring house, House B8, and he saw a man and woman arguing. Their words were sharp, cutting through the quiet morning air like daggers. Ethan didn't want to intrude. It wasn't his place to get involved, but he couldn't help but hear snippets of the conversation. "You never listen," the woman shouted, her voice cracking with frustration. "It's always about what you want." Ethan's stomach twisted as he heard the man's response, low but venomous. "If you just do what I say, everything would be fine." The sound of their exchange stopped Ethan dead in his tracks. He wasn't one to pry, but the anger in their voices was hard to ignore. He'd seen his fair share of arguments over the years, but this one felt different. It felt raw, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more happening here than just a couple bickering over something trivial. There was pain in the woman's voice, something deep, something he recognized. With a sigh, Ethan pushed the thoughts away. He had work to do. As he grabbed the first trash bin of the morning, he tried to focus on his task, but his eyes kept darting back to House B9. The arguing continued, the words only becoming clearer as he moved closer. "You always make everything worse," the woman said, her voice full of frustration and fear. "I can't keep doing this." The man's voice was low and steady now, the kind of voice that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "You don't have a choice. If you just do what I say, everything will be fine." Ethan's heart ached as he listened. The words were familiar in an uncomfortable way. He knew what it felt like to be trapped in a cycle of anger, to feel the pressure of someone's control. He had lived it, had suffered through it himself in the aftermath of his wife's passing. But this was different. There was a child involved. Ethan couldn't shake the sense that this was more than just an argument between two people. As he worked, lifting bins and emptying them into the truck, the voices next door grew louder. He tried not to listen, but the tension in the air was palpable. When he reached the end of his route and was about to move on, he couldn't resist. His curiosity and something deeper, perhaps a sense of responsibility, pulled him toward the woman. He knew it wasn't his business, but he couldn't just walk away. Not now. He walked up the driveway toward House B9, unsure of what he was going to say. He didn't want to intrude, didn't want to make things worse, but something inside him told him that if he didn't do something, he might regret it. As he reached the door, he hesitated. The woman appeared from the side of the house, looking exhausted and defeated, as though she had been carrying a weight too heavy for far too long. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. "Good morning," he called out, his voice loud enough to get her attention without startling her. The woman froze, her gaze flicking up to meet his. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes: fear, uncertainty, maybe even a little anger. She didn't speak, but her body language was enough to tell Ethan that she wasn't in the mood for small talk. "I was just wondering if you need more time with the trash bin," Ethan said carefully. "I'm happy to come back in a few minutes if you're not ready yet." She stood there for a moment, studying him. Ethan felt the weight of her gaze, the invisible walls she had built around herself. She looked worn, her posture slouched under an invisible burden, her face flushed with frustration and humiliation. For a moment, it seemed like she might snap at him, but instead, she just nodded slowly. "Right," she muttered, almost to herself. Thanks. Ethan hesitated. He wanted to say something more, offer some words of comfort, but he didn't know how. The look on her face told him that no amount of comforting words would make a difference. There was something deeper, something that went beyond an argument over trash, and he had a sinking feeling that whatever was happening inside that house was far worse than just a simple marital spat. He watched as she walked slowly toward the side of the house, her shoulders hunched, her every movement weighed down by invisible chains. Ethan could feel the urgency building inside him. He needed to do something, but he wasn't sure what. After a few minutes, he returned to his truck, but his mind was elsewhere. The silence that followed felt oppressive. He couldn't shake the image of the woman's face, the deep sadness in her eyes. The whole encounter had left him feeling unsettled, as if he had just witnessed something that went beyond his ability to understand. As the truck rumbled through the neighborhood, Ethan found himself distracted by the nagging feeling in his gut. The arguments, the woman's distress, and the baby items in the trash, none of it added up. Something was terribly wrong. When he finished his route and returned to House B9, he hoped things had calmed down. He prayed the woman had collected herself, that the trash bin would be waiting for him, and that he could just finish his day without any further complications. But when he pulled up to the house, his heart sank. The spot where the trash bin should have been was empty. His instincts told him to leave, to move on, but something about the situation wasn't sitting right with him. He glanced at his watch, knowing he was running behind schedule, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more. He had already seen too much to just walk away. Ethan could feel the weight of the morning pressing down on him as he sat in the cab of the garbage truck. He had completed his route and finished his regular work, yet he found himself distracted by the events at House B9. The argument he'd overheard, the woman's tear-streaked face, and the baby items in the trash had been haunting him. His instincts told him something wasn't right, but every part of him wanted to ignore it, to move on with his day, and leave the situation behind. But that gnawing feeling in his stomach wouldn't let him. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was just after 9:30 a.m. He had some time before his next scheduled pickup, but he wasn't sure what he would do with that time. His thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt and uncertainty. He knew the argument at House B9 had been troubling, but was it enough to justify getting involved? He wasn't a counselor or a social worker. It wasn't his job to intervene in domestic disputes. But the image of the baby items, now destroyed by the truck's compactor, lingered in his mind like an open wound. Why would someone throw those things away? They were clearly meant for a newborn, things that weren't just discarded in a fit of anger. There was a reason behind it, a reason he couldn't ignore. And if there was even the slightest chance that something had happened to that baby, Ethan couldn't let it slide. Ethan's thoughts wandered to his own past. His marriage had been far from perfect. He and his late wife had argued, fought, made mistakes. They had both been at fault for their issues, but at the end of the day, they had loved each other. He had been there for her, just as she had been there for him, through thick and thin. And now, with her gone, Ethan knew how much he missed the opportunity to do more. He couldn't let someone he didn't even know suffer in the same way without trying to make a difference. With a heavy sigh, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't just sit idly by. He couldn't let his hesitation be the thing that kept him from doing the right thing. He had to go back to House B9. He had to find out what was really going on, even if it meant pushing past his discomfort and getting involved in something he didn't fully understand. He started the truck, the engine rumbling to life with a sound that felt like a signal for the next chapter of his morning. The streets of Cedar Grove seemed different now, darker, quieter. It was almost as if the neighborhood knew something was about to unfold, but wasn't sure what it would be. As he drove back toward House B9, Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. What if the woman was just overwhelmed? What if she had been dealing with postpartum depression or some other kind of stress? Maybe the baby items had been discarded out of frustration, out of a sense of defeat. He tried to convince himself that it wasn't as serious as his mind was making it out to be. After all, he couldn't jump to conclusions. But then he thought of the man, Derek, and the hostility in his voice, the way he had spoken to the woman, the way he had belittled her. That wasn't something small. That wasn't something that could be brushed aside. Ethan pulled up to the curb in front of House B9, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes scanned the area, and he noticed that the front porch was empty. There was no sign of the woman or her husband. The house was quiet, the blinds drawn on the windows, and everything seemed to be still. It felt wrong. Everything about the situation felt wrong. He parked the truck and stepped out, taking a deep breath as he approached the house. His shoes clicked against the pavement, the sound loud in the otherwise silent street. He wasn't sure what he was going to say or how he was going to approach this. He only knew that he couldn't leave things unresolved. Ethan hesitated at the front door, unsure of how to proceed. He could just knock, say that he was here to pick up the trash, and see what happened next. But that didn't feel right. He needed to understand the full story. He needed to make sure the woman and the baby were safe. His gut told him that this wasn't just about a missed trash pickup. With a final deep breath, Ethan knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the quiet street, and he waited, the seconds stretching on far too long. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure there was no one watching, no one who might have noticed his intrusion. The last thing he wanted was to get himself involved in something that wasn't his business. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. The mandrake stood in the doorway, his face shadowed by the angle of the sun, but the look in his eyes was unmistakable. He didn't look surprised to see Ethan. In fact, he almost seemed to expect it. The hostility was evident in his posture. His arms crossed tightly across his chest, the muscles in his jaw clenched. "What do you want?" Derek's voice was low, cautious, but there was an edge to it. His eyes flicked to Ethan's truck parked at the curb, then back to him. "I'm here about the trash," Ethan said, trying to sound casual, though his voice faltered slightly. "I noticed you didn't put the bin out. I thought maybe you'd forgotten." Derek narrowed his eyes, clearly agitated, but he didn't say anything at first. His gaze lingered on Ethan for a moment, sizing him up before he finally spoke. "We don't need any help. Just do your job and get out of here," Derek snapped, his tone dismissive. Ethan wasn't deterred. He stood his ground, his voice steady, despite the tension building inside him. "I'm just here to make sure everything's okay. I saw some things that didn't sit right with me earlier." Derek's eyes darkened at that, and he stepped closer to Ethan, his presence threatening. "You don't know anything. Just go back to your truck." Ethan's heart raced as he stood there, facing the man who was clearly trying to intimidate him. But Ethan wasn't backing down. Not this time. "Is everything okay in there?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now but firm. "I heard the argument. I saw the baby items in the trash. That's not normal. Something's not right." Derek's face turned red with anger. His hands balled into fists, and he stepped forward again, this time invading Ethan's personal space. "You don't know what you're talking about. Get out of here, or I'll make sure you regret it." But before Ethan could respond, a faint sound echoed from inside the house, a baby's cry. The tension in the air thickened, and Ethan froze. His eyes widened as he glanced at the door, his heart skipping a beat. The sound of that baby's cry changed everything. Without thinking, Ethan pushed past Derek, his heart hammering in his chest. Derek didn't stop him. He seemed momentarily stunned, perhaps too shocked by Ethan's audacity. But the moment passed quickly, and Derek was soon chasing after him. Ethan's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he pushed open the door, his heart racing. Derek's voice faded behind him, lost in the thudding of his own pulse. The baby's cry had pierced the thick tension in the air, and Ethan couldn't ignore it. There was no turning back now. He had already stepped over the line, intruding in a space that wasn't meant for him. But that baby's cry, the sound of innocence and vulnerability, propelled him forward. He couldn't walk away, not when he knew something was terribly wrong. He stepped into the dimly lit living room, which was cluttered with discarded clothes, empty food containers, and forgotten objects strewn across the floor. It was a far cry from the neat, tidy homes he was used to visiting. The smell of stale food and sweat hung heavy in the air, clinging to the walls and the furniture. The once cozy house now felt like a prison, trapped in time, worn down by neglect and frustration. The baby's cries grew louder, pulling Ethan's attention toward a worn armchair in the corner of the room. There, wrapped in an oversized men's t-shirt, was a baby, barely a few weeks old. The sight of Hurtney, fragile and wrapped in such a makeshift blanket, hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His throat tightened, and his chest ached with a mixture of anger and sadness. How could anyone do this to a child? The baby's cries seemed to echo off the walls, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness. She was so small, so helpless, and yet here she was, abandoned in the middle of this chaos. She was nothing more than an afterthought to the people who should have loved and protected her. Ethan knelt beside the armchair, his eyes never leaving the baby. She looked up at him, her tiny face scrunched in distress, her little fists clenched in desperation. The helplessness in her eyes nearly broke Ethan's resolve. He could feel his anger rise, but he pushed it down. He couldn't let himself get lost in the rage. There was no time for that now. He gently reached out, trying to calm her down, but she continued to cry, her tiny body shaking with every sob. His hand hovered over her, unsure of how to comfort a baby who had already been through so much. With a soft voice, he murmured to her, "It's okay. You're safe now." But his words seemed to have no effect. The baby's cries only grew louder. Ethan's eyes darted around the room, searching for someone who could help him understand what was happening here. He spotted a pile of dirty towels near the doorway to the bathroom. They were stained, the fabric darkened by what looked like dried blood. The scent of rusted metal filled the room, and Ethan's stomach lurched. The blood was unmistakable. Without thinking, Ethan stood up quickly and moved toward the bathroom. His steps quickened as he approached the door, his mind racing with questions. What had happened here? Was the woman okay? Was anyone? He opened the door cautiously, peeking inside. The room was a mess, towels thrown carelessly on the floor, half-eaten meals left on the counters, and dirty laundry piled high in the corner. But it was the sight of the bathroom itself that made Ethan's blood run cold. On the floor near the sink, a small pool of blood had dried, soaking into the towels and the linoleum. The sharp metallic scent still lingered in the air, and Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. There was no mistaking it, this wasn't just an accident. Something had happened here, something far worse than what he had originally suspected. He didn't need to be a detective to know that the blood wasn't from a simple injury. Ethan's breath quickened, and his mind raced as he tried to process what he had just seen. His gaze shifted toward the pile of drug paraphernalia on the bathroom counter needles, a burned spoon, an overturned bottle of pills. He knew enough to recognize the signs. It was clear that Derek and Rebecca weren't just battling personal issues. They were drowning in addiction, and their lives had spiraled out of control. His eyes lingered on the blood-stained towels, his stomach churning at the thought of what had happened. Had Rebecca been injured? Had she tried to harm herself? Or worse, the baby? The realization hit him hard, and for a moment, Ethan felt paralyzed by the gravity of it all. He stepped back from the bathroom, shaking his head. He needed to focus. He needed to make sure the baby was okay, to get her out of this place, away from whatever twisted nightmare was unfolding inside these walls. He couldn't let her stay here any longer. He couldn't let the woman and man, whoever they were, get away with this. Ethan turned back toward the living room, but before he could act, he heard footsteps behind him. Derek had reappeared, his eyes wild with fury. He had likely been inside the house, but the moment he saw Ethan, his anger exploded. "What the hell are you doing here?" Derek shouted, rushing toward him, fists clenched. "I told you to leave. Now get out of my house." Ethan didn't flinch, even as Derek came at him. "I'm not leaving until I know that baby is safe," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. "You need help, Derek. Your family needs help. You're not going to get away with this." Derek stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing with a mix of disbelief and rage. "You don't know anything," he spat, his breath hot with anger. "You're just a garbage man. You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to judge me." Ethan stood tall, his expression unwavering. He had spent years trying to convince himself that he wasn't responsible for anyone else's misery, but today was different. Today, he couldn't stand by and watch as someone else's life, especially a child's life, was ruined by addiction and abuse. He couldn't let this family continue to spiral. "You're right," Ethan said calmly, his voice low but firm. "I'm just the garbage man. But today, I'm making sure that baby is taken care of. I'm calling the police." Derek's face contorted with rage. Before Ethan could react, Derek lunged forward, shoving him with enough force to send him stumbling back. Ethan hit the wall with a thud, but he didn't let it break his resolve. He had already made up his mind. "Get the hell out," Derek shouted, his voice shaking with fury. But before Derek could do anything else, a faint sound interrupted him, the sound of a siren, the distant wail of a police car, growing louder with every passing second. Ethan's heart leapt in his chest. He had done it. He had called for help. Thank God, Ethan muttered under his breath, his relief palpable. The sirens grew closer, and Derek's expression faltered. The fight drained from his face as reality began to sink in. Ethan had taken the first step in ensuring the baby's safety. Derek hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between Ethan and the approaching sirens. Ethan could see the uncertainty in his gaze, the fear that now gripped him. He wasn't in control anymore. By the time the police arrived, Derek was being restrained, his hands cuffed behind his back. Officers flooded into the house, quickly sweeping the rooms and securing the scene. Rebecca, still disoriented and barely conscious, was gently helped by a female officer, her hands trembling as she clutched the baby close to her chest. Ethan stood back, watching it all unfold, the weight of the morning's events slowly settling in. The baby was safe now. The woman, though still in need of help, was going to get the care she needed. And Derek was going to face the consequences of his actions. As the officers moved in, Ethan allowed himself a moment of relief. The decision to step in had been difficult, but it was the right one. He had saved a life today, and though it wouldn't fix everything, it was a start. The future was still uncertain for Rebecca and her baby, but Ethan knew that this small act of intervention had set in motion a change zone that would affect not just their lives, but his as well. The weight of the morning's events hung heavy in the air as the police moved swiftly through the house, securing the scene and arresting Derek. Ethan stood just outside the front door, watching as the officers did their work, his body still trembling from the intensity of the encounter. His mind raced and his heart hammered in his chest, but in this moment, the chaos of the house seemed to have finally quieted. The sirens, the shouting, and the anger, everything had reached a boiling point, and now, for the first time in what felt like hours, there was silence. The kind of silence that echoed in your bones. Rebecca was led out of the house by a female officer, her eyes unfocused, her steps slow and unsteady. Despite her condition, she clutched the baby tightly to her chest, her face pale and drawn. The baby, the same one Ethan had seen wrapped in a worn t-shirt, was now quiet in her arms, her cries replaced by soft, shallow breaths. It was a small victory in the sea of tragedy that surrounded them. Ethan had seen many things in his years as a garbage collector, had witnessed the devastation of neighborhoods as they declined, the sorrow of families who had fallen on hard times, and the quiet resignation of people who had given up hope. But none of that compared to what he had just witnessed inside that house. It wasn't just the mess or the brokenness. It was the disregard for a life, a tiny, innocent life, that had no control over the situation. That baby didn't ask for this. She didn't ask to be born into this chaos, this cycle of addiction, neglect, and violence. She had no voice, no choice. But thanks to his intervention, she had a chance now. She had a chance to grow, to be cared for, to find safety in a world that had been so cruel to her from the start. And Ethan had been the one to make that difference. As he stood there, watching Rebecca being led to the waiting ambulance, a flood of emotions hit him all at once. The weight of his past, his loss, his regrets, they all seemed to wash over him, pulling him back into a place he had tried to bury. He thought of his wife, of the daughter they never got to raise, and of the emptiness that had settled in his heart when their lives had been torn apart. That grief, that pain, had never fully gone away. But as he stood there, witnessing the rescue of another life, of this baby, of Rebecca, he realized something profound. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for him too, a way to heal, to move beyond the guilt, the sorrow, and the what-ifs. The officers turned to Ethan as he stood on the porch, lost in thought. Detective Ruiz, a seasoned investigator with a calm demeanor, approached him, his expression one of respect and quiet acknowledgement. "You did good, Carter," the detective said, his voice low but sincere. "We'll take it from here. You called this in, and you saved that little girl's life. That's not something you can ignore." Ethan nodded, but the words didn't quite reach him. "I just did what anyone would have done." The detective raised an eyebrow. "Not everyone would have done it, trust me. People don't always get involved. even when they see things they shouldn't ignore. Ethan's gaze shifted to the ambulance, where Rebecca was now being attended to. "I couldn't walk away," he said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. "I've seen too much in my life to just let it go. That baby, she didn't deserve this." Detective Ruiz gave him a thoughtful look, then nodded. "No, she didn't, and now she has a chance. That's because of you." The weight of those words settled in Ethan's chest. He had been a witness to so much in his life, often too many things he wished he could forget, but today, he had been more than just a passive observer. Today, he had acted. He had made a difference. And in that, he realized something important. He wasn't just the garbage man anymore. He had the power to change lives, even in small, quiet ways. As the officers finished their work, Ethan stepped back into the truck, his hands still trembling, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. He glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing his reflection staring back at him. It wasn't the same face that had looked back at him when he had started his shift that morning. No, today, Ethan saw something new. He saw someone who had done something right, something good, and he couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction that filled him. He started the engine and slowly drove away from the house, the neighborhood now a quieter place. The sirens were fading, but Ethan could still hear the echo of the baby's cry in his mind. A cry that had been heard, that had been answered, a cry that in the end had saved a life. The truck rumbled through the streets of Cedar Grove, its familiar hum a comforting reminder of the work still ahead, of the routine that Ethan had always relied on. But as he made his way down the street, he noticed something he hadn't before. The houses were still, but the air felt different. The tension had lifted, the uncertainty had faded, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. A hope that no matter how broken the world around him seemed, there was still a chance for things to get better, for people to change, for lives to be rebuilt. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for him to do the same. As he pulled up to the next house and began to collect the trash, Ethan allowed himself a moment of reflection. Today, he had acted. He had made a difference. And though the road ahead would still be difficult, the lesson was clear. Sometimes, the smallest action-sown person stepping forward, one life saved, can change everything. And as the sun climbed higher into the sky, Ethan Carter found peace in knowing that today, he had given someone a future. He had given that baby a chance at life. And in return, he had begun to heal his own. If you found this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, heart-touching narratives. Stay tuned for more stories that explore courage, hope, and the difference one person can make. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to change lives, one story at a time.